and you are gaining something also from this. Today we have Narayan Devanathan, and I have shared the profile of Narayan, and there are so many things in his profile, that it makes a very exciting reading. But I will just share a part of that profile. And if you look at the brands like Honda, Dulux, Canon, DS Group, Airtel, Maruti Suzuki, TVS, IKEA, HT, and so many in that, Carlsberg, Den, Max India, Toshiba, Panasonic, and the list goes on. And in many, many such brands, we have Narayan who is involved in this. What is interesting about Narayan is that he graduated in biology. Now, not to say that people who study science are not creative, but looking at myself, and when I look at Narayan, that's what I find the difference, that he graduated in biology, and then he went on for marketing, mass communication, and advertising, and he has worked in India as well as United States. He writes regularly in various magazines and newspapers. He has written in Economic Times, Financial Times, Business Standard, Mint, and many other trade publications. He has worked, served on the juries also of APEC FES Award, the Indian FES Award, Maddies Award. Narayan, some of them I may not be familiar also. My only interaction with advertising was that when I took my first job, I was in advertising from the client side. So, that's how I interacted with agencies. I worked for around 1 year or so in advertising from that aspect. And after that, I didn't do much in that. So, Narayan, thanks a lot for coming with us and sharing your experience. And the topic that you have chosen also is very interesting. It's maybe, I don't know what you have to say, but it's very exciting about capitalism. So a creative person talking about capitalism would be a wonderful thing to hear. Thanks, Narayan, and all yours, please.
Thank you so much, Sanjay, and thank you for everybody who's here. I was browsing through the names on the screen, and I did see a couple of familiar names. So hello to Rajiv, hello to Mandeep, and a couple of others that I saw. But thank you so much for making time on this Wednesday, or is it already Thursday? I'm losing track of time, as I'm guessing all of you all are as well. Some wise person, I think, early on in the lockdown had said that, there are only 3 days of the week now, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So here and today, that much I think I can guarantee for now. But what I wanted to actually first touch upon was connecting a couple of dots that Sanjay already spoke about in my profile. And thank you for that kind introduction. I'd rather put all of that aside for now, but I do want to say that I borrowed from one of the concepts that I thought I had completely forgotten from my biology degree, and I found it surprisingly relevant for the topic at hand today around capitalism. And if some of you saw my tweet yesterday around this webinar, you might have noticed that I actually quoted this French naturalist called Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And I will be briefly referencing him, and I think he's still relevant, even though his ideas have been long abandoned by biologists themselves. But I'm jumping a little all over the place. So the topic I've chosen today, I've titled it as 20 Questions for Capitalism. And I have a sense that even though I'm one of the people, and I don't want to overestimate the importance of the advertising business, but I do believe advertising is in some ways the spark plug of capitalism, and the marketing business is an engine of capitalism. Although with the move to electric engines, maybe spark plugs are not needed as they were before. But I was posing a very existential question for the larger system of capitalism, because increasingly I'm confronted with it both at work and in my personal thoughts as well. And I thought it might be interesting to go completely out of my depth and see if I can interrogate this topic and see if I can present it interestingly for you as well. And I started actually by looking at the dictionary definition of capitalism. And I do want to caveat one thing as well. I know I'm on camera. I did prepare for this, and I'm not going to wing it through, and therefore I'm going to be looking at my screen and reading. Okay, so I was starting off by talking about the textbook, the dictionary definition of capitalism itself, right? And when you look at those two words that are there at the beginning of the definition, and I'll read it out just to emphasize it: an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. And what immediately struck me when I looked at it was that the nexus between politics and business is built into the very definition of the concept. I guess you could say that the word crony in crony capitalism is redundant, if you will, right? At this point, before I jump further, I would also like to reference that French naturalist that I spoke about, right? Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Now, a lot of you are doubtless aware that Lamarck's theory of evolution by inheritance of acquired traits has been abandoned, at least by the field of biology. I think the one mythological piece of evidence that still clings on to us is the notion that, look at giraffes, right? They never used to have long necks, and the way they are now is because of the long necks, because of the evolution that happened so that they could reach the foliage at the higher reaches of trees. And over generations, that acquired trait kept getting passed on and kept getting inherited. Of course, genetic theory has debunked all of that, and there is overwhelming evidence to say that while Lamarck might have observed what he did, it's not necessarily what is the reality. But some of his ideas are actually adaptable to the worlds of behavioral economics and social psychology. In fact, I think the idea that learned behaviors are passed on down generations, acquired and passed down to generations, is, I think, fairly established in the social sciences field. And the second part of it is the use and disuse of certain characteristics, and therefore some becoming vestigial, right? The more important part, though, was the theory of adaptation, by means of which an organism, an organization, a community, an entity becomes more fit to survive in the world. And I want to use this theory of adaptation to talk about capitalism in the context of how I think it needs to evolve. But having established that, I want to talk about the title just a little bit, right? So why is it 20 questions for capitalism? And in case any of you are wondering why it isn't 15 or 25, I'm using the format of the popular game that some of you will be familiar with, and it's variously called Bullseye, or more commonly 20 questions. The idea is to get to a final answer using 20 questions that need to be phrased so that they can be answered with either a yes or a no. I've improvised a little bit to elaborate on the yes or no that follows each question. And I should also upfront state that I'm way out of my depth here. I'm neither an economist nor a politician, but I'm hoping to use that to my advantage here. While I have some answers, what I'm hoping you might find most useful are the questions I have. There are questions, like I said earlier, that I have been asking myself for a while, and I hope they provoke some thought in you also. Before I get to the questions, though, I wanted to share a quick video that I thought might provoke thought to begin with. So let me play this, and hopefully the audio will work as well.
If there is an audio, then there is no audio that is coming.
Sorry?
If this clip has an audio, then we are not able to hear any audio.
Oh, you're not able to hear any audio?
No.
Okay, let me try it one more time.
My desk is on the 7th floor. you need anything, you can
Yeah,
call
no, it's fine.
me.
How about now?
Make sure you
Yes.
have your ID with you because you're going to need to badge in every time you re-enter. Cafeteria is on the 4th floor, and we generally take lunch about 12:30.
This is where I'm sitting?
For now, yeah. With the big move coming up, it's kind of crazy around here. I promise it's only temporary.
All right, thank you.
We need Airbnb. Not an Airbnb. Where are we, man? I don't know, man. I don't even know what city we're in. Look
World leaders are declaring a global state of emergency until the app situation can be
Narayan,
resolved.
it's breaking a lot. Actually, it's not proper.
Okay, who wants to go first?
It's right.
Please come to peace.
I just ate this whole pizza by myself. Hashtag too delicious to share. Hashtag pizza emoji. Farm bill 2 right here, y'all. Hashtag it's the food. Brian, looking for Brian. Hashtag does anybody want a slice?
Narayan, it's not coming properly.
Okay, I'm going to improvise without the video. So I'll describe it and I'll
Sure. Yeah.
point. So that was actually a piece of communication from Apple where it showed a worldwide apocalypse happening because the entire Apple app ecosystem collapses. And so all the things that we're used to doing, right? So playing games, finding our way around the world using maps, playing Candy Crush, calling an Uber, booking an Airbnb, anything that we are familiar with, suddenly everything stops when the iOS ecosystem stops, right? And it seems more real than ever a possibility in the current world scenario, if you think about it, right? I mean, we're all locked down at home, and the one thing that seems to be keeping us sane is the internet and the app ecosystem that has us going. And imagine if that were to collapse. Definitely sounds like an apocalypse. But the point I wanted to make is that actually 2 points. Outside of the US and maybe Japan, for most of the people around the world, Apple phones, the iPhones, actually are in the hands of only 15% of the world's population. 85% of the phones run on Android. So if Android actually claimed that the world would come to an end if it didn't exist, it would probably be closer to the reality than when Apple claims it. But we still believe it because that's the power of the brand. But the second and more important point is Apple is actually defining for itself a purpose for existence, right? It's talking about why it exists and what would happen if it didn't exist, which is not a question that we ask ourselves often. I want to ask this question, begin with, of capitalism. What would happen if it didn't exist, right? And that I have go provide messages around the answer. So my first question actually is this: is capitalism even alive today? And let me tell you why I'm asking this very existential question, right? But before I answer that, before I go on to the elaborate answer, in my estimation, the answer is both yes and no. And it seems like a very convenient thing to say. But as Wisecrack recently said at the beginning of the lockdown, if capitalism is so great, how come businesses need to be bailed out by governments every few years? Look at the evidence on hand. As recently as last evening, and Sanjay pointed out that clashing with this right now, the finance minister is detailing out the packages of the 20 lakh crore relief that Prime Minister Modi announced last evening. That's roughly equal to 10% of our GDP. We're not alone in this, right? So the US, a few weeks back, Donald Trump announced a $2 trillion package that was about 14% of the US GDP. The UK announced a 5% of the GDP package. Japan tops the list with about 20% of their economy, and so on. So about 166 countries have announced relief packages for the economy, and a lot of that is going directly to aid businesses. Now, if the free market is such a fabulous thing, why does it need to be bailed out by government all the time? That's the first question, which leads me to the second question. Is this the first time that capitalism is facing a crisis of this scale? And the quick answer is no. And I'm going to go back about 600 years, a little over 600 years, to the very origins of capitalism, if you will. Although the formal origin is traced more recently to the 17th century. But I go back to the time of the Great Plague in the 14th century in Europe that wiped out 60% of the population of Europe at that time. Imagine that the entire population of Europe was 80 million and 50 million people died in those years of the Great Plague. And you know what was responsible for the rapid spread of that? We know it in a different shape and size today, but globalization in the form of the shipping trade played a central role in the spread of the disease and the devastation that followed. Sounds familiar, right? We all know that the disease has entered across borders through travelers who've been part of the globalized trade network today. But capitalism actually really came into its own after the Great Plague of the 16th century, of the 17th century in England. I guess we've always had this outlook that a crisis is too good an opportunity to waste. And while the post-World War I crisis of the Great Depression in the US did see capitalism in the best of light, the last big crisis we saw unfolding, that of the 2008 financial meltdown, it didn't have any other natural or man-made disasters to thank for its origin. It was completely of capitalism's own making. Which brings me to question number 3. Are there common features between previous existential crises for capitalism and the current one? Again, the quick answer is yes. But this is where I think I want to delve into the fundamentals, the pillars of capitalism, if you will. Right? There's obviously been the core tenet of capitalism's ideology throughout, which is profit above all. There is the commonality of the dichotomy between the exploiters and the exploited. We're seeing this really starkly on the highways and train stations of India right now. But we're not unique in this. The US, arguably the most advanced political economy in the world, and I emphasize the word arguably, is seeing it in spades. Then there is a stark contrast of the gain of the elite versus the pain of the masses. There is the precedence of economics over universal equality and freedom. And of course, there is the eternal dance between politics and business. All of this is being played out more publicly than ever before during this current crisis, which begs the fourth question. Is this precipitated by what is the core tenet of capitalism, a nexus between politics and business? Again, the answer is yes. The truth is, capitalism would like to believe it is free from government's intervention. All conservative governments across the world promise maximum governance, minimum government. But we know the reality is far from it. We also know that the reality is that capitalism is maybe free from government to some degree, but it's never free or far from politics. And as I said before, crony capitalism is a redundant phrase. And maybe it's time we stop pretending there isn't a nexus, a lot of times, a nefarious one, between the two. And I'm going to bring up some examples here again, right? Recent ones. Take the case of the builder lobby in Karnataka and the stopping of migrant laborers from taking trains to go back home. It exposed not only a nefarious nexus, but a blatant one. Or the case of LG Polymers in Vizag, where the leakage of styrene cost a dozen deaths. What's come out now is that the company had explicitly stated they did not have the requisite environmental clearances for operations, but the government still turned a blind eye and allowed them to continue with their operations. These dots connect very, very obviously and blatantly, like I said. But there are other instances, and not just in India, where the connections are not so apparent. Take the example, if you followed US news carefully, take the example of the nominee for the post of Postmaster General in the US. On the face of it, it seems like a fairly innocuous and regularly bureaucratic appointment. But where things start get interesting is when you get to know that the nominee is one of the most prominent donors to the Republican Party, that he has been a long-time vocal critic of the US Postal Service. And here's the important thing. Given the COVID-19 crisis in that country, postal ballots will likely have a huge role to play in the November election. And that's something he will control. So connect the dots, right? Which brings us to question number 5. Doesn't the free market system balance itself over time so that there is equal opportunity for all? And the answer it'll sound like I'm equivocating, but it's yes and no. And I'll tell you why it's both yes and no. Theoretically, yes, that's the foundation of this system, but it fails to account for social systems of discrimination and oppression that cause sections of society to be opportunity deprived over time, while the privileged continue to gain. As again, a really recent example, you may be aware of this number, but the world's billionaires added $282 billion to their personal wealth in the last 5 weeks during the coronavirus crisis. $282 billion. That's actually the number of the relief package announced yesterday by the Prime Minister. Jeff Bezos has personally added to $24 billion to his fortune. And yet, Amazon workers are being laid off or being sued for being whistleblowers for malpractices by Amazon's management. So is the free market system balancing itself? I think the jury is out on that. So am I saying that the fundamental flaw in capitalism is the inequitable distribution of the fruits of labor? I didn't intend that one for sure. And I'm not trying to be Karl Marx's spokesperson here either. But again, the answer is yes and no. And it's because the inequality lies not only in the distribution of the fruits of labor, but also in access to capital and in the deployment of capital towards stimulating production. I'll repeat that again, towards stimulating production and not consumption. It also lies in the inequitable access to knowledge and networks. But most importantly, its most critical flaw lies in the fact that it sees the creation of wealth as an end in itself. You know, I was listening to this old talk by Harsha Bogle at IIM Ahmedabad from 2005, where he talks about the perception that has become pervasive around why people want admission into IIM Ahmedabad. Because the question that everybody asks when you get admission into IMA is, do you know what your starting salary is going to be for your batch? And it goes back to wealth creation or wealth enjoyment as an end in itself, rather than the real answer, which he spoke about, which he said was, but what kind of career are you going to build? The path being more important than the destination. And likewise, if you do need outcomes, maybe we shouldn't be looking at wealth as an outcome in itself, but as a means to a society that is freer, more just, more equal in the enjoyment of opportunity and outcome. So that seems like these are all baked tenets of what ails capitalism now. But coming to present times, which is my 7th question, surely the current crisis is due to the ongoing health emergency caused by the coronavirus, right? I'm actually going to say no, not exactly. Because if you think and peer under the surface a little bit, what you'll see is that it probably stems from capitalism's unpreparedness, to some extent unwillingness to act on anything that does not stimulate demand. A guy called Edward Abbey, and he said this in the 1980s, he said, growth for the sake of growth is the motto of the cancer cell. Now that seems to fit the bill for the current avatar of capitalism, and maybe I'm being too harsh. But think about it, even cancer is now lucrative because demand is now predictable to an extent, and production of health services can be estimated and profited from suitably. But I'm an optimist, and despite all the gloom and doom I'm talking about, I'll tell you why I'm an optimist with capitalism. The coronavirus pandemic is a disruption in much the same way that the Great Plague was in 17th century England. Back then, it brought about a fundamental change in thinking about the use of wealth. From making cathedrals and castles, wealth began to be deployed as capital in the creation of more wealth through a shift from commerce to industry. And that's a very fundamental shift if you think about it. All trade was around commerce, or around the exchange of goods, not so much around the manufacture and production and the increase in industry. And that was the pivot that was caused by the Great Plague of the 17th century. I'm hoping that we might see a similar transformative shift now too, thanks to the coronavirus. But if the unwillingness and unpreparedness is what is behind capitalism's crisis of the times, what is behind that unwillingness? What is behind that unpreparedness? Is it individual greed for wealth and power on the part of a few? Or is it a scarcity of integrity? Or is it an inadequacy of knowledge and experience, and not just in the hands of those who control industry, but the rest of us as well? I know that's 4 questions there, but my answer to all of them is yes. I've already spoken about Jeff Bezos as a not so shining example of this seemingly unchecked greed for wealth. In his case, at least right now, it doesn't seem to be for power. We're also seeing the latest of Elon Musk's shenanigans. As recently as yesterday, he put workers at the Tesla factory in Southern California at risk by opening the factory against the county's laws. Now, this lack of integrity and empathy in a social context, it's not new in Elon Musk. But one stark proof point about his seeming megalomania converting a lie is the lie that he's actually the original founder of Tesla. He's not, but he's turned that myth into a reality and sold it to the world. That's right, Elon Musk is not the original founder of Tesla. But that's what's not right. What can be right? There's the question of knowledge, as I said. So a truth about the world, and it's as true of humans as of other species, is the herd mentality. A minuscule percentage of people actually want to lead, and an even smaller subset of them know how to lead for the benefit of everyone else. The rest of us neither think of nor know how to lead. We're mostly awaiting instructions. I think last evening was a good example of that. Or finding ways to avoid following those instructions. We're always trying to see how to avoid the liquor line, for example, when things opened up around that, or to get around them. We're good at jugaad, as the cliche goes. So the rest of us, to repeat that, neither think of nor know how to lead, and we're mostly awaiting instructions or finding ways to avoid following those instructions. As a result, there is a concentration of power and control, which is never a good thing for long, and a decentralization of chaos. These two factors mean that a clash of exploiters and the exploited will be inevitable unless the exploiters, by way of deceit or force, keep the lid on the exploited. It sounds a little convoluted, but let me break it down using Karl Marx. He called this wage slavery. We've become used to the idea of consumption and are tied inextricably with the urge to earn in order to consume. We seem to be prone to Stockholm syndrome when it comes to consumption. This brings me to question number 9. So at a systemic level, what am I saying? That capitalism has become too closely tied to consumption and consumerism for its own good? In a word, yes. And again, I'm going back to the origins of capitalism. What originally started off as a production-based economic system, remember I said moving from trade to industry, has now become over-leveraged on consumption. Think about it. Capitalism, which was based on the use and growth of capital, is now based on lending and borrowing, not so much on capital. All the unicorns of the new economy are not built on capital, but on borrowed wealth. So much so that producers and consumers alike are living by the motto of, I always live within my means, even if I have to borrow to do so. I think we're finally going to turn that corner. I'm hopeful about it, that we will no longer entertain unicorns that just keep touting GMV, but actually know how to turn a profit. And it's a bit of an insult to the idea of capitalism itself, if you think about it. Question number 10. So with this systemic failure or this attachment to consumption, is there also a lack of integrity at a systemic level that breeds more disaster and more cynicism? And by now, you probably are wondering how I dare to call myself an optimist, because my answer to this question is also a yes. I'm going to share this video, although I think it will not play, so I won't share the video. I'm going to talk about this case study. So there's this company called State Street Global Advisors out of New York. And a few years back, they actually started a fund for people to invest in that would in turn fund new startups by women entrepreneurs. So the idea was to encourage female empowerment in the world of business and to fund companies that were run by women. And in order to do this, they set up a statue of this little girl facing up to the iconic charging bull on Wall Street. So that's what they did, a bronze statue of this little girl fearlessly looking at the charging bull, which was this sign of virility and masculinity and everything that was supposed to be wrong with the idea of toxic masculinity. It went completely viral. It caught the imagination of everybody. The mayor of New York City, Bill Blasio, adopted it as an official property of the city of New York. And it went on, the fund actually went on to gather $370 million based on that fearless girl's statue. And everything seems right about this, right? So here's a company that's taken up a brilliant cause. It's done the marketing in a brilliant way. It's brought in the business results. What could go wrong? I'll tell you what went wrong. State Street Global got sued because they did not have adequate representation of women on their own board. So when you come at any global issue with a lack of integrity, it only reinforces the cynicism about this concept called capitalism. Now, these first 10 questions I intended to present to you what might seem like a really bleak outlook for capitalism. But I'm going to once more state for the record that I'm a reckless optimist. And the next 10 questions, I'm going to actually explore how we can turn this around. I'm going to try and apply Lamarck's theory of adaptation to see if capitalism actually can adapt to a better way of being that is consonant with our times. And which brings me to question number 11. We're all familiar with this, I think, in the world of business. We already know about this idea called the triple bottom line. Isn't that the movement we need towards and a sign that capitalism is actually reinventing itself? And I'm going to say an unequivocal yes here. But the yes is in theory, if you think about it. How many companies' annual reports have you seen which actually declare a triple bottom line? If the three bottom lines of people, planet, and profit were actually in place, we wouldn't be seeing the millions of migrant workers on the roads or the record unemployment filings in the UK and the US, nor would we have a climate crisis on our heads. Fossil fuel companies, as an example, knew about the impending climate consequences from their own scientists as early as 1975. And you know what they did? Nothing. They chose to ignore them. It's only now, with resources depleted, global public outcry, and nascent laws encouraging more sustainable energy sources, are we seeing actually the energy sector shift their focus. India's richest man has shifted his focus only now from oil to the new oil, namely data. And even then, we're already witnessing all the transgressions we saw with the old oil. On a side note, again, I'm sure some of you already caught this. Did you know that a new range of Reliance Jio feature phones are going to be brought out with a default version of the Arogya Setu app pre-installed? I'll let you chew on that. See, ensuring the triple bottom line in a partnership, and I'm saying that in quotes, between the likes of Facebook, already got a fabulous record with privacy laws, Reliance Jio, and a somewhat pliant government will be a challenge. But unless we take it head on, we will face all the consequences we have that the military industrial complex around oil set up across the world. We've already seen evidence of this new transgression globally with the mess around Huawei. But what we have, at least in the TBL, is not just an accounting framework, but an accountability framework to hold capitalism to its promise. That's the first ray of hope for me. Which brings me to the connected question. So is it as simple as that? Does capitalism merely need to shift from a shareholder focus to a stakeholder focus? Again, the answer is yes. But again, this is not a new idea. But it is an idea that is in dire need of implementation urgently. And when it is implemented right, great things happen. I'll give you the example of this California-based credit processing company called Gravity Payments. Some of you might have heard of it. A couple of years back, the CEO took a massive pay cut himself and implemented a minimum wage for all employees across the company of $70,000 a year. Think about that, $70,000 for any employee in any department, any function across the company. And more recently, he called an all-employee virtual meeting during the lockdown to gather inputs and decide on the course of action in a post-COVID world. As a result, more equitable and voluntary pay cuts were initiated across the company. The CEO himself sacrificed his entire salary. That's not just in the US. Closer home, take a look at the Bajaj Group. The CEO has announced that not a single person would be laid off as a result of the ongoing crisis. A third example is of this company called Patagonia. It's an outdoor equipment and clothing company. And they're one of the fiercest advocates committed to the cause of planetary rejuvenation. And they go so far as to actually talk about what they don't do right. They talk about the fact that they don't want you to keep buying their clothes. If you have something, it's probably good for at least 10 years. So please don't come back and shop. On their clothing labels, they tell you the right way to dispose of their clothing if you think it's worn out too much. And so they also list out the trade practices that they have, which are not necessarily following the environmental guidelines that they would like to. And therefore, if consumers decide not to purchase them, they're okay with that. But they're saying that we would rather be upfront about it and showcase our integrity rather than hide things. And they're doing really well because of that. So a stakeholder focus around society, around the planet, around shareholders, obviously, might actually enable capitalism to move forward in a way that it hasn't before. Which takes us to question number 13. I've referenced Karl Marx a couple of times before also. Am I actually saying that we need to move towards socialism? The answer is no, not necessarily. I keep switching between the origin story of capitalism and where we are today, and I'm going to do it one more time. If you think about the pre-Middle Ages, when capitalism was still in its infancy, I think that was the time that the world really learned the perils of feudalism. And the extreme case of communism, especially in the former USSR, cautioned the world about the risks of socialism taken to the extreme. Both of them tended to cluster power in the hands of a powerful few, because in those times, they lacked the counterbalance of democracy. The current version of capitalism, though, it seems to be threatening to present a similar imbalance with wealth and power concentrated in the hands of too few disproportionately. And no amount of generous philanthropy is going to cover up the enormous inequity in the creation and distribution of wealth in the first place. Why does Jeff Bezos need $24 billion more in the time of this crisis when his workers are actually being fired or sued? We're seeing tendencies towards autocracy in several parts of the world, whether driven by power or ideology or the ideology of power. Certainly with Trump in the US, the far right in Italy, Orban in Hungary, Vučić in Serbia, and the ongoing anti-pluralistic tendencies in India. And while the democratic socialism of a Bernie Sanders or an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the US may seem extreme to some, what's important to note is that democracy can serve as a counterbalance to both socialism and capitalism, which is where I think we can go back to the nexus between politics and business in the very idea of capitalism in the first place. And again, I'm going to underline, that's not necessarily a bad thing always. So is there a responsibility for all of us? I've spoken about business leaders and entrepreneurs and business people, but what about the rest of us? After all, we are all equity holders in a democracy. Is it also our responsibility to hold capitalism to a higher standard? Again, the answer is yes. That's the wrong answer on the screen over there. Let me not confuse you with that. But let me talk about the business citizen in all of us first. I think it behooves us to be more knowledgeable about the web of connections between our actions as employees, as leaders, as business people, and their consequences, between our actions and their consequences. We obviously need to be more aware of our duties towards our planet and our society. And currently, sometimes, only sometimes, we unthinkingly fulfill our duties towards our employers and organizations. Much like the media are supposed to, and I repeat, the media are supposed to hold truth to power, it is probably also our individual responsibility in the world of business too, to speak truth to the profit motive. At what point and at what cost do we say the pursuit of profit alone is not worth it? Can we put our money where the mouths of 1 million hungry migrants are and not in the mouthpieces of those seeking more wealth and more power? I think we are already at that point where we need to speak up. I talked about the business citizen, and likewise, is there a responsibility for the citizen consumer as well? And again, the answer is yes. I'm going to take recourse to another meme, a really wise meme creator, again at the beginning of the lockdown said, it's telling how the world sees that we are now facing an economic crisis because we are only consuming what we need. The reality of human nature is that we don't just have needs, we have wants. But as the lockdown has shown, we can curb our desires if forced to. Can we voluntarily do so? Not in a spirit of austerity or asceticism, but to enable a more equitable satisfaction of needs for everybody. Can we, again, not become puppets at the hands of desire creators? And I'm guilty of trying to be a desire creator myself. The answer, once again, imperative is an urgent yes. We have to take on this mantle of speaking truths to the profit motive. All of this seems to point to the opposite of a consumer economy or a consumption economy. But is a production economy possible in today's times, and is it even desirable? I spoke about this previously, but I'm going to bring it back here. One of the seminal shifts that marked the coming of age of capitalism was a move from trade to industry. And in some ways, we seem to have come full circle back to trade rather than industry being at the heart of the economy. Stock markets, of course, are about trade, but technology is enabling newer platforms and marketplaces for the exchange of goods, but not necessarily producing newer things or more efficient ways of production to meet demand. Coupled with borrowing as the means of financing, capitalism and capital is losing its core meaning. A shift to a production economy could possibly mean an investment-first approach in which capital will again play the central role. A move to meet demand rather than stimulate demand will also see more balanced consumption. And with a more aware citizen consumer, savings rather than borrowings will increase. I'm sure many of you are aware that the 15-year savings rate for India is at an all-time low. But if we up that, that will in turn enable the flow of capital more fluidly across the economy to enable production investment. So a virtuous cycle, if you will. That's not to say that we ought to abolish stock markets or devolve newer marketplaces, but a production-first outlook can probably enable more equitable distribution of both supply and demand. Okay, so this is not socialism or even democratic socialism. Can we call it equitable capitalism? Sure, I think that's not a bad way, even if I say so myself. There are other phrases that have come about as well: benevolent capitalism, conscientious capitalism, enlightened capitalism. These are all been phrases that have been tried as well. The reason I like equitable capitalism is because it denotes the contribution of both democratic principles and business fundamentals. It also signals an equal responsibility to look at the triple bottom line via societal stakeholders, planet stakeholders, and profit-seeking shareholders, and equitable distribution of both input and outcome to all these groups. I look at it again, and it seems lofty and idealistic. So question number 18 is it practicable? And I'll tell you why I'm saying yes to it, because I don't think we have an option at this point, because it has to be. It might seem on the face of it like an airbrush to paint away the ugliness of the current candidate we have in the present form of capitalism. But as the COVID-19 crisis has shown, it is only with devolvement of control and a returned focus on industry, not trade, that true progress and not mere growth can happen. Take even just the case of the UK and its approach to finding a vaccine for the coronavirus. Because of the centralization of power, even in the area of healthcare, the world-leading universities and researchers across the country are unable to contribute to the cause. But equitable capitalism would spread both risk and reward, labor and outcome across the system to the benefit of many. Which brings me to my penultimate question. So ultimately, whose responsibility is it to trigger this change and carry it forward? Those in power? Those of us who vote them in and out? Those who create desire? Or those who manipulate the system to their private ends? And once again, the answer to all of these questions is yes. It's on all of us. I think that is the point of being equitable. The spoils can't be shared equitably if the efforts and the responsibility and the duty of it is not taken on equitably. Which brings me to my final question, which actually is hopefully a way to close the loop. Again, at the end of it all, is capitalism alive, and will it sustain itself? And my answer is yes. And I'm going to paraphrase Winston Churchill. This is a famous quote of it on democracy, but I'm paraphrasing him to say, capitalism is the worst form of an economic system, except for all of the others. What we have now, and how can I resist throwing in some really contemporary cliches? What we have now more than ever is an unprecedented opportunity to create a new normal with equitable capitalism. So thank you for listening. That's all I have. I can't hear you, Sindhu. You're on mute.
Sorry. Wonderful. What came to my mind is, how do you live with, such contrasting positions? One, like what you have said, and one second, what you do. Very interesting. But I won't ask any question. I will leave the questions to participant. And the first question, I think I would allow Atul Marwa. Atul Marwa, if I can find him, I will unmute. Atul, kindly unmute yourself and please ask questions. You will ask not more than 2 questions, but if possible, ask one only.
No, sir, sir, good evening to you. Hi, Narayan. I'm Atul Marwa. I am on your talk was extremely informative, very intriguing, and I was just wondering, that isn't one of the most fundamental virtues of capitalism, as you defined it, innovation, and whether if we look at control, and isn't capitalism as you defined it really mutually exclusive and analogous, from a perspective, and do we recommend a hybrid system, which you had actually defined, basis a demographic character and in a situational context, because of a certain, eventuality which is unforeseen, like this, which has happened in the present context, or something which we want to give a direction to subsequently? Will that define what kind of governance in capitalism, or a mix of both, we should have? I mean, what is your view on that?
And she's one of the first to point out, in the beginning of this crisis, everybody said this is a black swan event. Nobody could have. What is called?
Sorry, Narayan, you were unmuted for a few seconds. Can you repeat, please? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to pick up on a couple of things that Atul spoke. So thank you for that question again. The first is that, at the beginning of this crisis, many people said, this was unprecedented, completely unforeseen. There is this policy expert called Michelle Wucker, and she was one of the first to point out actually that, no, this is not a black swan event. It was not unforeseen. I mean, we've known healthcare experts predicting something like this would happen. We know Bill Gates said this in 2005. There have been books written about the onset of pandemics. This was not unforeseen. We were just not prepared to act, even having seen the signs. That's number one, and maybe that's one of the faults of the current system of capitalism. But I think the second part of it is that there's this writer called Anand Giridhar Das, again, Indian American born of Indian origin. And he has this telling phrase to describe the state of the world, especially the state of the world as shaped by capitalism. He says, we don't have an innovation shortage. And all of us are always trying to innovate and out-innovate each other. He says, however, what we do have is a progress shortage. And maybe if we can divert the attention of all of the forces of capitalism towards enabling equitable progress, that's where the powers of innovation can maybe devote their energies towards. I don't know if that answers your question, Atul, but those are 2 things I picked up from what you said.
No, indeed. I was just wondering that, with your questions, which have been very intriguing and very relevant, I would suggest that even if such a pandemic was known, the timing of it kind of was unexpected in most cases, I think, globally, because people obviously have been impacted naturally because they were unprepared. So that, I would assume, is a correct perspective to your thought. I would, what would you recommend, Narayan? I want an answer now with the questions you've raised are immense. They've really valuable, that what would you recommend in a situation like this? Does a hybrid system of capitalism and socialism emerge as a possible solution? I mean, do we need to compartmentalize these as separate entities, or can we create an amalgam of the qualities which are relevant in context of a situation, is what you would recommend?
I would be completely out of my depth if I actually made such a strong recommendation, but it seems like that's kind of what is needed. There's a UK-based economist called Paul Collier, I think. Hopefully, I'm not mangled his name. So he has very interesting perspectives on the idea of decentralization of power in government and how that dovetails into the success or increasing the success of capitalism. And there is a marriage needed. And like I said right at the beginning, capitalism as a system is the marriage of politics and economics at all times. And trying to find that balance, trying to, if you think about the concept of marriage also, it is an always evolving dance. And I guess we need to evolve with the times now.
Thank you. Thank you, Narayan. Yeah,
okay, Shivani, please ask your question if you're there online. Yeah, go ahead.
Good afternoon, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible, Shivani.
Yeah. So, sir, one thing I would really like to say is that when you talked about how capitalism is actually being brewed by consumerism, I completely agree to that point. Also, one question that I would want to ask is that the whole scenario you talked, that capitalism is right now being built on grounds of borrowed wealth. So don't you think it is in itself a leveling field, because today it's not only somebody who already is wealthy, already has that capital, can probably start a successful organization, but probably anyone who has those skills and that passion can.
It is a conundrum, and I don't know if I have an answer to that immediately. Because you're right. I mean, if it wasn't the case for the ability to borrow, only the Ambanis and Adanis and the Tatas and Birlas of the world would continue to be building business empires. And so where would be the democratization of enterprise then? Which is where, I guess, without it being completely dependent on government, if the facilitation of capital can happen through government a little more equitably, I would imagine that's one way to go into that. But maybe all we need is a slight pulling back of the recklessness with which borrowing has been happening lately, right? I mean, you have to look at disasters like WeWork globally, or in India with housing.com, to know that it's a bit of an unchecked juggernaut, and maybe we just need to pull back a little bit to make it a little more rational versus a bit of out of controlness it feels like right now.
Sure. Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, Narayan, there are a few questions on YouTube. I will read them for you.
Sure.
Pratik Dake asks, do you support privatization over publicization, which is government control, or a mix of both in a certain ratio, especially in health as well as energy sector? And second question is by Rajesh Srivastav. Capitalism has become so eminent that it affects our everyday life, every sphere of our life. Will there be any new form of capitalism in coming days? So these two questions are from YouTube.
Thanks. Who was the first one from?
First was Pratik Dake.
Thank you, Pratik. I guess, I mean, there's no question of not supporting privatization. I guess what I would like to see is a much more robust system of checks and balances. I think we're seeing a lot more rampant variety of crony capitalism than we have ever seen, or maybe we're just aware of it a lot more now thanks to the glare of 24/7 media and social media. But it just feels like now the colluding forces between civic society, politics, business are stacking up against equitable distribution of the rewards of capitalism, and therefore I don't know how we'll find the balance between more of a public sector driven market system and a more free market system that is driven by the private sector. But we need to find the balance. I mean, again, I go back to some of the work by Paul Collier in the UK, right? I mean, until the late 70s, it was always around more of a socialist tendency there, until Margaret Thatcher came and said there is no alternative but the free market system. And look at today's UK, Brexit apart, even the Conservative Party led by Boris Johnson is now leaning towards state-led funding for a lot of the things. I mean, the NHS has always been around over there, but maybe there is a way to not go to the extreme left of Indira Gandhi-led policies, but not merely put on new clothes to the same policies of the Congress that the BJP now is doing, and still not delivering to the promise of maximum governance and minimum government. The second question, sorry, could you repeat that, Sanjay? You're on mute.
Capitalism has become so eminent that it affects our everyday life, every sphere of our life. Will there be any new form of capitalism in the coming days? I think you talked about that.
Yeah, I hope so. That was my talk. I hope so.
Yeah, okay. Now we'll bring in Madan Kumar online. Madan, kindly ask your question, please.
Yes, sir. Sir, you were quoting evolution at the start. If equitable capitalism is more adaptable and if it is more fit, won't it evolve by itself out of natural selection? Should we be promoting it or should we be trying it? It happens naturally, right?
No, so Darwin's theory was that it happens naturally, but Lamarck's theory was that it happens by use and disuse of certain characteristics. And I guess I'm actively advocating disuse of some characteristics of capitalism currently.
In that case, there is not much possibility of any disuse of within brackets crony capitalism in this world. So are we doing some wishful thinking out here?
Absolutely doing wishful thinking. I'll tell you another thing that I stumbled upon some months ago. As it turns out, the framers of the US Constitution started off with a single seminal rule before drafting the Constitution. And that rule was that people are stupid and you cannot trust them with power. Now let's put in the checks and
Thank you. And they called it democracy, right?
Thank you, Madan.
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Madan. Let me put a sequence: Amol Devore, followed by Abhishek Anand, followed by Sandeep Sharma. And I will ask one question from YouTube again, and then we'll end Narayan. So,
okay.
Amol Devore, please come online.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for giving the opportunity. I joined late in the session, but whatever was, I think, very insightful and then very intriguing. So, Narayan, thank you for that session. So, I would like to ask, I guess there are a lot of minimalist movements are also started picking up in the US and in Western countries. There are a lot of takers for that, and then they are actually trying to give up a lot of things an average American used to own. So I believe these movements will also come to India. Indians were already doing it, I feel, but will we go to extend what Westerners did and then come back to the minimalist movement, what they are following it right now? So what kind of approach we will take as an Indian? What do you feel about it?
That's a really interesting question, Amol, and thank you for that. I think the contrast, for me, the immediate contrast is that for a majority of us in India, we are already living minimalistic lives because not out of choice, but because we don't have the means to access more. And until we are able to satisfy those minimal needs of people, we probably won't be able to go through the cycle of evolving to being driven by desire and higher planes on Maslow's hierarchy, and then come back down to minimalism. However, I think India has shown that we kind of circumvent the linear process for many things. For example, one of the things in the US that is attracting younger generations to democratic socialism as defined by Bernie Sanders or AOC are the disappointments with Trumpian capitalism and the Republican Party's capitalism. But on the other hand, we've always had left-leaning student movements across time in India. And maybe we won't even need a much longer extreme push for us to see that coalescing into something very real. We're seeing the likes of Chandrasekhar Azad, and we're seeing Kanhaiya Kumar kind of mobilizing their voices. But in fact, I was remarking to somebody the other day that if the CPI doesn't take advantage of the current crisis and the opportunity in it, they are probably they deserve to die. But I'll go back to my basic premise that I think a lot of us still have not attained that minimal level of quality of life, and once we get there, then maybe we'll think about minimalistic living.
And there is a question on YouTube by Nikita Sarni. Nikita asks, we are talking about minimalism, less of a consumerism. How we waste money in non-essential services, it got to appeal to many. It is perhaps the ideal thing to do, but are we ready for it?
It's a very good question, right? I mean, this, if anything, this lockdown has been a good experiment around that. But I have a sense for where we might go even with that. We might need fewer things, but our demand for their being of the best quality probably will be sharpened a little more. So I might want basic dal chawal, but I want the best recipe for it. I might want to go for a walk, but I want to make sure now that the air is clean and the levels of air quality that I'm used to now, I'm going to demand that. So maybe fewer things, but maybe more demanding about those fewer things.
Thank you. Sandeep, if you're online, please ask your question.
Yes, thank you, Professor. First of all, thank you, Narayan. It's been wonderful listening to you in a very interesting conversation. I think in the entire thing, you talked about 2-3 things. One is about greed, lack of integrity, needs and wants kind of thing. Now, capitalism per se, I think, is needed because it actually gives employment. It creates opportunity of people. I mean, there are stories of kings in many parts, especially Rajasthan, other places, where they would engage people to build palaces so that they get, because you can't just donate money to people and they may not be willing to take it. A capitalist society per se is not bad, because a rich person, if he has those desires, he actually gives, as this employment. I think question is about being very insensitive in terms of making money through wrong means, being dishonest, borrowings, indiscriminate borrowing and all that. I think that is something which is far more dangerous to the society. But capitalism per se has proven that, yes, it's a case of merit also. It has to be, merit-oriented kind of society also, where people who have the merit, they make more money, but at the same time, they do it the honest way and then provide employment to others. I think that balance, if it comes in a society, I think each one will be happy. The poor will also not complain. But when it is all about integrity, the nexus, the various examples that you have given, or the kind of people in private sector who have made money and run away from the country, I think that is where people start questioning the entire platform of capitalism. I don't know, what is your take on that? Capitalism minus all these things with good values, I think overall is good for the world.
No, absolutely, Sandeep. Like I said at the end, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, right? It's the worst form of an economic system, except the others are worse than this.
Right. You can maybe stop your screen sharing and you will come online. Last question, Payal Agarwal, and then we'll end. Payal ji, go ahead. I will unmute you.
Sorry, may I finish my response to Sandeep? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. Oh, okay. I thought. Sorry. Please go ahead.
Yeah. No, so yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, anything else is worse than what capitalism brings to the table, Sandeep. But I guess the other reality of it is that, and I'm a huge fan of the Game of Thrones books. I've not watched the series, but I've read all the books. And the reason I'm a fan of them is that I think it exposes humanity in all its frailty. And unfortunately, that's going to be an inseparable part of how we function as a species. So we'll just have to keep putting in the checks and balances at all times.
Thank you. Yeah, Payalji, go ahead.
Yeah, hello, sir. Good evening. Sir, I have just asked you how have done this so many multi companies work. You know, I have seen your profile. So how have you done all this?
Oh, I work in advertising. So I get to work with multiple clients.
Okay.
Yeah. Narayan, Madan wants to know which series you are a fan of. That's something.
Oh, beyond Game of Thrones? Oh, in terms
Game
of
Thrones. Okay.
I haven't watched the show though. I only read all the books.
Okay. Wonderful. So he will also follow the same, I think. Okay. So thank you. Thanks a lot to all the participants. Thanks to you, Narayan. It was a wonderful session.
Thank you.
I think every time I consume something more than what I need, possibly I am going to think about you and ask the second time, should I buy this? And will it help people, you know, at the lower strata of the society? Certainly this past 1 month or so has taught us that we can live within our means and we consume much more than what we require. And the good thing is that, at least personally for me, health has improved. And I have lived in 5 pairs of dresses, 5 dresses in entire 1.5 months. You know, I didn't require anything more than that. And all other things are lying useless at home. No car was required, no two-wheeler, no cycle, walking to office and home, that was good enough. So thanks a lot, and we'll request you to sometime come again in future and share some aspects from what you do also, like advertising. And we learn from that also.
Thank you so much.
Sanjay, 5 is still a good number.
Thank you. Yeah, Sandeep, I will try to reduce that also. Thank you.
I'm managing with 3, you know.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, sir.
Then we
you,
know
Narayan.
that, you know,
Thank you, sir.
Professor Sebastian will be coming.
Yeah, he will be. So our next talk will be on Friday, 4 o'clock. Professor Sebastian Morris will be coming, and he will be responding to the last talk, but he will also be talking about Madam Nirmala Sitharaman's talk, speech that she would have given today. I have not heard that. So Sebastian will also talk about that. So I will inform you about the link. Narayan, please keep on joining on our future talks also. I will keep on mailing to you.
Will do.
Can you suggest some books?
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Narayan, some suggestion for books
to read
on this topic?
Yes. Or whatever, based on your experience in the full length and breadth of the industries, what you have done.
So, the topic of interrogating capitalism, I would recommend 2 books. One is the writer that I mentioned called Anand Giridhar Das. The book is called Winners Take All. So that's definitely one I would recommend. And the other is by this Canadian activist called Naomi Klein, Klein, and the book is called No Logo. I would recommend both of those as good reads.
Okay, thank you, Narayan. Thanks a lot. We'll meet sometime again online. Okay, bye. Thank you. Bye to all of you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Sure. Please do take care of yourself and your family also.
Thanks, sir. It's a
Thank you.
real good
Thank you,
initiative.
sir. Thank you, Narayan.
Thank you. Thank you,
sir.
Jay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Narayan.
Sir, thank you.
Thank you, Santosh. Thanks a lot.
How are you, sir?
I'm fine. I'm fine. Thank you. Chalo, I will switch this off because we are still on live.
Thank you, Sanjay sir.